Okay, we're back. Now we're going to take a look at the story of the cleansing of the temple. And in fact, I'm going to gently suggest that particularly in Mark's version, and really even in Matthew's, cleansing of the temple is probably not the best way to think of the story. But let's get to that as we do in due course. Let's now take a look at Mark's version first, since his is the longest. Okay, you find him on the right side there. He begins with them leaving Bethany and seeing a fig tree. Okay, and of course there are no fruit. There's no fruit in the fig tree because it's not in season, which is entirely understandable. This is Passion Week. We're nearing the time when Jesus is about to die. It's entirely understandable that there would be no figs in the fig tree, given that figs, of course, don't come in to fruition until usually late August, early September. Okay, but nonetheless, the Lord curses the fig tree. Okay, a very kind of interesting action here, which a little unusual perhaps that he would do this, but we can see what Mark is going to do with the story here. All right, Mark will now continue on down to discuss their entry into Jerusalem, into the temple. So we'll scroll down and take a look at that. Now they enter Jerusalem, and then we begin the very familiar actions of the temple cleansing, so-called. Okay, Jesus begins to drive out those who buy and sell. He flips over the tables of the money changers. He doesn't let anyone to carry anything through the temple. And then he quotes from the prophet Jeremiah. Actually, it's from both Jeremiah and Isaiah. It's a dual quote. The house of prayer comes from Isaiah 56. That the den of thieves comes from Jeremiah. So he quotes there, and the chief priests and the scribes heard this and seek for a way to destroy him. Very interesting. This is, in Mark's presentation of things, really the sign that triggers the enemies of Jesus to finalize their plans against him. Okay. Now, what's interesting about Mark's version is what happens afterwards. One of the things. Now we see here that they pass by in the morning again, and now we see the results of the fig tree. Okay, that the fig tree is now withered away to its roots. There's nothing on it at all now. The leaves have died. The poor tree's died. You know, the poor tree which didn't bear fruit when it wasn't supposed to bear fruit anyway. Okay, Jesus says, the disciples notice, Jesus says, have faith in God, and then he tells them all the things that you can, in effect, do with faith. Okay, but what I want to call attention to here is the importance of this idea of the fig tree. Notice that the story of the fig tree began before the temple and, in effect, concludes after the temple. This is the familiar technique which we studied at some length this week, called, the fancy name is intercalation, but the more colloquial name is sandwiching. Okay, when Mark tells a story, he begins the story, he interrupts it with another story, and then concludes the original story. Okay, and there's usually some device at work in this. The story is in effect interpreting, the outer story in effect interprets the inner story. Well, how is this the case? Well, notice the result of this is that Jesus curses a fig tree. Okay, he curses a fig tree and finds it then accursed. Now, how does this relate to the temple? Well, this is, in effect, the curse against the temple. Okay, really what Mark is, in effect, saying is that just as this poor fig tree has been accursed by the Lord, so shall the temple suffer this accursement. Okay, this accursing. Okay, this really is in some way the symbolic action of Jesus which seals the temple's fate. Now notice here, and we go back up and look at the temple cleansing story again, how then we understand this particular action of Jesus in the temple. Jesus goes in, he flips over the money changers' temples, he proclaims this is a house of prayer, but you've made it a house of robbers. Now, given the logic of the fig tree, this really can be understood not so much as a temple cleansing, but rather Jesus, in effect, symbolically acting out God's judgment, future judgment against the temple. Okay? perhaps as a warning, but really not even so much a warning, but as, the down payment in effect in terms of what's going to happen. Okay? Prophets actually very frequently do this in the Old Testament. They don't prophesy only through speech. In many cases, they prophesy through their actions. Okay? Elijah, in effect, prophesied by going down to Sinai like Moses did. Okay? Hosea prophesied by taking a wife of harlotry to symbolize God's own anger at his own bride, Israel, who's become a harlot. So in many ways, the prophet will express the mind and the will of God through his actions, and this is exactly what happens here. This is not so much a cleansing as it is a symbolic acting out of judgment. Now, let's take a look at Matthew's version, which is similar to Mark's in some respects, but has some important differences. Okay, we see it over here on the left. First, there's no intercalation. Okay, there's no part about the fig tree in the beginning. Okay, it may be that Matthew found the part about cursing the fig tree out of season to be a little awkward or unusual, and may have reworked it for that reason. It's hard to say, but be that as it may, he puts the fig tree material after the temple activity, as we'll see. Okay, but notice here, Jesus enters the temple of God, and again, the language is very similar for the first two verses in terms of what we see with Mark. Okay, the same quote from Scripture, the same activities in slightly more abridged form, and we see then there's a healing after this, however, in verse 14. That's not in Mark. And there also then in verse 15 is an actual clash between Jesus and his religious opponents. Notice here, the chief priests and scribes and Pharisees saw the wonderful things that he did and the children crying out in the temple, and they're indignant. Okay? So this is in some way, an invective against them, particularly against people. Okay, and they say to him, "Do you not hear what these children are saying?" Okay, and Jesus says to them, "Have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast brought perfect praise?" Okay, and leaving them, he went out of the city in Bethany and lodged there. Now, what's going on there? Well, keep in mind, when Jesus quotes Scripture, as he frequently does against his opponents in Matthew, he's largely setting himself up in terms of this ongoing religious debate with his opponents. Okay, in other words, Matthew is very, very interested in portraying Jesus in his gospel as being someone who can out-interpret the Pharisees, who knows the law better than they do. He knows Scripture better than they do. He can out-reason them. In other words, he can out-Pharisee the Pharisees. He can out-rabbi the rabbis. In other words, he knows the law and knows its meaning and application better than they do. Okay, this is a very particular concern of Matthew to portray Jesus this particular way. He's very much concerned, but showing that Jesus, in fact, does not act below the law, but in fact exemplifies the law, whereas it's his opponents who do not. Okay, and to keep in mind that the basic dichotomy of the two kinds of people who meet Jesus in Matthew, the people who are blind and lame and come to be healed, the outsiders, versus the insiders, the opponents, the chief priests and the scribes, okay, who don't get it. All right. So you see here there's some very familiar themes here, but this is very different than Mark's version. Okay, Mark's version is the simple sign that generates opposition, whereas here in Matthew, the pressure is taken off a little bit, the actual action in the temple, and more the opposition that's generated seems to more dissolve just on Jesus himself and upon his followers and his teachings. Okay, especially his healings and the actual adoration and the favorable response he generates. That's the thing that seems to derive opposition. It's out of sheer jealousy, in other words, that this opposition of the chief priests and scribes seems to gather weight. Okay, so let's continue on down now. Okay, now in Matthew's version, it's very interesting. All the fig tree material is located after the temple cleansing sign. Okay, now returning to the city, he's hungry. He sees a fig tree by the wayside, and he goes to it and sees nothing but leaves on it. Okay, and he says, "May no fruit from you ever come again." And the fig tree withered at once. Okay, the disciples marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" Okay, so in other words, a somewhat different sign than what's described in Mark. Whereas Mark, it's sort of a two-stage sign where the sign's done once and not noticed till later. Here, it's all at once. Okay, but why? Well, in some sense, it seems to be that Matthew is speaking in terms of the whole city, okay, being under the judgment that's coming. In other words, I don't think the judgment has a radically different meaning in Matthew versus Mark, except it seems as though the way Matthew structured the story, he wants to take a little bit of the pressure off the temple alone and more have a diffuse sign that's really against the whole city of Jerusalem. You see here, it's after he's returning to the city that the fig tree is cursed, and this is after he's left, whereas the residents of the city, the rulers of the city, are opposed to him. So it seems to be that Matthew wants to remind us of a more diffuse judgment against the whole city, and in particular the opponents of Jesus who are in charge of the city rather than simply the temple itself, which Mark focuses on. You see here, there's a slight difference in emphasis. Okay, the temple sign is again, I think, in many ways a symbolic acting out of judgment, but here it's a more diffuse kind of a judgment, a dispersed kind of a judgment against the whole city. And actually, Matthew doesn't like Jerusalem very well, very candidly. If you follow his gospel, he tends to want to shift the focus of things to Galilee. This is one of the reasons why the risen Lord appears exclusively in Galilee in his resurrection appearances, because that's really the place where the church's mission begins. Okay, it's not the holy city, so-called, that's Matthew knows well is going to be doomed. Okay, so again, keep in mind, it's still not really a temple cleansing as much as a symbolic acting out of judgment, but notice the judgment falls upon a sort of a broader, diverse group of people, a whole city, if you will. And this is, of course, another way the judgment can be understood. Okay, very good. Let's stop there, and now we will have even more fun by throwing Luke in the mix.